Amen. I want to share a truth from this passage of Scripture that I call burdens and blessings. You know, everyone goes through experiences in life that they may not want to endure, but they do anyway. They do it for the sake of the reward that's waiting for them at the end. In fact, they hunker down, they put their nose to the grindstone, knowing that if they pay the price and they endure it all, that it's going to be worth it in the end. It could be something as simple as a diet of fruits and vegetables that you despise. Can I get an amen? You may not enjoy it, but you endure the displeasure of it all because in the future you know that there is waiting for you good health and maybe even a physique that you've always wanted. It's kind of like medicine. You can hold your nose and you can take it for the moment, knowing that it's going to be worth it after you endure the pain. Or it could be your job that you have to force yourself to go to every day. Even though you can't stand it there, it's as though you don't want to be there one more day. You tolerate it because of the promised retirement that it's going to provide you one day. You endure it. You go through the pain of it all, and you get yourself up out of bed, and you go every day knowing that there is going to be an end to it. Isn't that the way we all are? We can go through the most difficult things of life that we tolerate if we know there is an end to it. And it's not uncommon for people to endure things like a boring diet or an unfulfilling career. And they may seem like unpleasant burdens that they tolerate because they know there's something waiting for them in the end. They're no longer going to have to do it. They're going to be able to lay it down, and they're going to be free of all of it because they'll be in a new arena. But when that transactional thinking becomes a part of the motive that drives your spiritual life, it can rob you of a blessing that God wants you to have, not only here, but for all of eternity. And this was the danger among the crowd, the people who were there to hear Jesus in a message that was very near the end of his ministry. Jesus is right in the heart of his final application of the Olivet Discourse from Matthew chapter 24. As soon as we hear Matthew 24, we all know he's talking about the end times. He's giving us all of the signs and the prophecies of the end of the age. And now we come to Matthew chapter 25, and he could have very well, at least as far as I'm concerned, he could have very well gone on to explain all of the details of the prophecies that he just gave. He could have given all of the nitty-gritty of the signs that he just laid out for everyone. Things that we all want to know about the rapture. Things that we all want to know about the second coming. Things we want to know about the tribulation. And things that we want to know about this emerging Antichrist. Where will he come from? And when is he going to make his presence known? But what does Jesus do? He doesn't give the crowd what they're longing for. He doesn't give them what they're clamoring for. He gives them stories. Isn't that interesting? The greatest communicator in all the world is not giving the people what they want. He gives them the story of the 10 bridesmaids. He gives them the parable of the 3 talent investors. And then he tops it off with the account of the sheep and the goats. I mean, it doesn't say this, but I can safely assume that this was not the follow-up that they were looking for when they wanted to know if all they had done and all that they were doing and all that they had planned to do in their religious lives to make sure that it was going to be enough that they could be a part of all that he was describing. They wanted to know that they were making the grade in order to be a part of all that he had just described. Were they timing things right? I mean, were they being holy on the right day when he shows up? Because if he just gives me the date, I can temporarily be on my best behavior. If he just tells me what the signs are, I can look around and I can kind of get a feel for when he's going to be here, and I can make sure that I'm ready. That's kind of what Jesus was talking about when he referred to the man who, if he knew that the thief was coming, he would have never let his house be broken into. You kind of get the idea? But as you know, being ready for all that Jesus just described could mean a lot of different things to the people that were listening in. To the people who were standing on the hillside hearing Jesus give the Olivet Discourse, being ready for what he was describing could mean a lot of different things, depending on your view of him, depending on your idea of what he was referring to when he was talking about the kingdom of heaven, and also what you believe that eternity really is all about. All of the wives' tales and all of the legends about eternity, all of that played into what they were hearing when Jesus told this parable. But I ask the question that you're probably asking, and that is, why give them parables at this strategic moment when it seems like it would have been so logical for you to go through and give them a timeline of when is all this going to happen? People for hundreds of years have been trying to take Matthew chapter 24 apart and say, this is going to happen here, this is going to happen here, this is what the Antichrist is going to look like, and here's where he's coming from. And people throng to those kinds of messages. But what do we know about parables? What do they do, and why did Jesus tell them, and why did he give them to the people at this strategic moment in time? Well, we know that they have the ability to separate the people who can hear from the people who can't. They have the ability to split people in two, into a crowd of those that can hear and those who can't, those who can see and those who are blind. And after his message on the end of the age in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus now seems intent on one thing: distinguishing those who are his true disciples and those who are not. He doesn't necessarily point them out and say, you go in that group and you go in that group, but he lets them determine for themselves through the vehicle of a parable, what crowd do you really fit in? It's so interesting that Jesus' final message here on the Mount of Olives literally echoes the very same message at the heart of the first message that he preached back on a mountainside in Galilee, the Sermon on the Mount. These messages are like bookends. There's the one in the beginning, the Sermon on the Mount, and now we're hearing the last discourse, Matthew chapter 25. And what's so interesting about these bookend messages, the beginning of his ministry, the end of his ministry, is that there is a theme that runs all the way through it. He doesn't fall for the tricks of the theologians that are trying to lure him into traps. He doesn't get caught up in all of the social things that are going on in Rome at the time, but instead he stays the course and he continues to communicate the same message over and over and over again, all the way through, from the first message to the last one 3 years later. In fact, remember in the beginning in Galilee, he begins in Matthew chapter 5. You remember, this is the very beginning. The 400 years of intertestamental silence is broken by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount when he says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but instead I've come to fulfill them. And then 3 verses later, in verse 20, he says, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses, that goes beyond that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Those are pretty sobering words. But then jump all the way forward 3 years later, in the end at Olivet, he said in Matthew 25:29, this almost cryptic message when he says, whoever has is going to be given more, and they are going to have an abundance. But whoever does not have, even what they have, is going to be taken from them. And the crowd probably scratched their head and said, what does that mean? What's he talking about when he's saying, it sounds like he's saying that the rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer, and we're against that. We think everyone should have the same. But Jesus isn't referring to the financial economy of this world or even in first century. He's talking about the economy of the kingdom of God. He's talking about the economy of grace. He's talking about what it means to be in communion with God. And so it makes sense that as he was about to leave his earthly ministry, he's about to depart from his disciples, that he would introduce the second parable in Matthew 25 in verse 14 this way. He starts out. He says, the kingdom of heaven will be like a man who goes on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one of them he gave 5 bags of gold, and to another 2 bags of gold, and to the third one he gave 1 bag of gold, each of them according to their ability. Now, you may be reading a translation that says talents, or bags of gold, or something else. We can deduce from that it's really not necessary for us to even focus on what the gold is or what the treasure is. That's not what the parable is meant to focus on. We get caught in a trap when we try to figure out, is it gold or is it talents? Because if that was really the focus of what Jesus was sharing the parable for, then the master would have given them detailed instructions on what to do with the gold after he left. Step by step, 1, 2, 3, this is what you're to do with the gold when I leave. But they got nothing. They heard no instructions as to what to do. Why? Because the master already knew. He knew how they would respond to the gold. He knew how they would proceed with the treasure based on their view of him, based on how they perceived him. So it wasn't necessarily what they were holding in their hands. It was what they had in their heart toward him. He already knew what they were going to do. He already knew the direction they would go. Look at this parable. Let's take it apart. The natural response of the first 2 was to go out and begin acting on behalf of the master. That was the natural response. No one had to tell them to do that. No one had to give them instructions. That's just naturally what they did. To do business and involve themselves in the affairs of the master. The things that are important to the kingdom was the natural thing for them to go out and do, as though they were honored to do so, as though it was a privilege to do so, as though it was the very thing that they had been anticipating wanting to do from the very beginning. Oh, we've been given this treasure. Let's go act in behalf of him. Let's be an expression of him. Let's be an ambassador for him. It's the natural thing you do, right? And then the third man takes his bag of gold and he buries it in the ground. This wasn't just a bad investment decision. This was a reflection of his heart toward the master. He did what he did with his life because of how he viewed the master. He invested himself, he lived, he talked, he thought, he gave himself to those things based on how he viewed the master. Look at verse 24. When the accounts are being settled, he says, Master, I knew that you're a hard man. Well, I would have stopped him right there and said, how in the world would you know that? Where did you ever get that idea that that's what I'm like? Did you have some kind of a hard-nosed preacher when you were a kid that yelled at you and scared you out of your pew? Is that how you got the idea of me, that I'm like that? But I digress. He says, Master, I knew that you're a hard man, harvesting where you've not sown and gathering where you've not scattered seed. So I was afraid. I was afraid. I listened to the fear gospel. And I went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. I'm giving it back to you. Here's where the parable begins to soak into our lives. Because to this man, the treasure was a burden to be endured until the master returned and he could finally be relieved of its obligation. It was as though the treasure that had been given to him was somehow inflicting his life. He was carrying it, and he was undergoing the burden. And it's how some people live their Christian lives. They endure the obligations of the Christian life in anticipation that there's coming a day I'm going to cross the finish line. I'm going to get to lay it all down, and I'm not going to have to do this anymore. You can hear it. I did my time. I paid my dues. let the younger generation do those things. I'm done with it. I'm just going to sit back and coast across the line because I've built a resume that's going to get me there. It's like a prison sentence, leading to a day when they're finally going to be freed. If you were the kingdom owner, the one who held all of the treasure, how would you feel if there was someone in your family who was in your family just because they were wanting what was at the finish line, and they were enduring you just so they could get to the treasure? I would feel the same way. So how should God feel when there is a celebration of worship and someone says, well, I'm going to drag myself out of bed. I'm going to go down to it's cold outside. It was cold this morning. And I'm going to go through it. And then they're going to ask me to give. You know, that church just wants me for my money. And they're going to ask me to volunteer to something. I'll do it. I'll give the 10%. I'll even use a calculator to make sure that it's exact and it's not more than that. If you're God and you are the one that's being celebrated, how do you suppose he feels when someone is approaching him with that kind of an attitude? If I were him and I'm not him, I would say, hey, don't get out of bed. Don't waste your time. In fact, don't bring your sour attitude over here and spoil my celebration, because your attitude might bleed over to the people around you and you'll turn my celebration into a drudgery, and that's not what I'm about. But the other two men, isn't it interesting? No instructions. No one gave them the code, but they instinctively and immediately throw themselves into the master's business as though it is the greatest privilege in all of the world. I mean, what are they going to get out of it? They didn't have any promises that they were going to get a 10% cut. They didn't have any promises that the master was going to split it with them if they made a profit. And this is how some people live out their Christian lives. Whether they're worshiping in a church or scrubbing a floor or cleaning toilets, it's as though they're getting to do. It's as though they're getting to be involved in the greatest privilege in all of the world. It's amazing to see people like that. It's amazing to be around people like that, that no matter what they're doing, no matter what they're going through, it's as though life is a privilege. I'm getting to do this for the master. I'm getting to be his ambassador. And they spoil the day for those that are having a pity party. There's an old saying that gets thrown around. I'm sure you've heard it. You can't take it with you when you go, right? People will tell that joke, there's never been a luggage carrier on the top of a hearse. You know, you can't take it with you when you go. Well, let's take that apart for a minute. That is true of your possessions. Everything you have stuffed in your house right now, including your house, and your bank accounts, and your car, and your collections, and all of those things, it's not going with you when you go. Hopefully you have a will or a trust that's going to guide where it goes when you leave, but it's not going with you. I've done enough funerals where they've stuffed all kinds of things in the casket, and I'm sure those things are still in the casket today. Nothing against that. If you want your golf clubs with you, more power to you. That's all right. I'll still do a funeral where there's golf clubs in the casket. Nothing unspiritual about that. But it won't go with you. And that's how it is with our possessions. But there's also something else that won't go with you, but it's different. It's the things that we did out of obligation, that we accumulated thinking that it was somehow righteousness that was going to get us across the line. Things that we did that was in the category of good behavior, checking off boxes, giving percentages, and all of those things that we have in our minds. The motive that we did them with is that it's going to get me across the line in the end. You say, well, none of that's going to go with you when you go? Well, if you did them out of obligation and it was a drudgery to do them for, 70, 80, 90, 100 years here, why would you want to do that forever? If it was an obligation, a drudgery, something you really didn't want to do, but you did it because you felt like you had to get across the line and to finally get there, it was just my way to get in, then you would lay it down and not want it to be something that would last forever, right? You won't want to take it with you when you go. So it leads to the question that I'm asking you that I feel like the Lord would ask all of us. What do you want to take with you when you go? I mean, if you're being dead level honest with yourself, what do you want to take with you when you go? I can tell you, if you're in an intimate, warm communion relationship with God, where everything you do is out of love for Him, as though it's the greatest privilege to be involved in anything that makes Him happy, anything that brings a smile to God's face, if those are the things that motivate you, that drive you, that cause you to want to spring out of bed in the morning and serve Him, you not only can take those things with you when you go, but there's much more of the same waiting for you when you get there. There's much more of the very same thing waiting for you when you get there. This is the truth at the heart of Jesus' call for us when He says, take up your cross and follow me. It's not as though that's a burden. It's kind of that old saying that He's not heavy, He's my brother. Well, He weighs as much as anyone else. What makes Him different than anyone else? Well, I have a relationship with Him. If I was carrying someone else, they'd be really heavy. But this is someone that I love. They're as light as a feather. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying there will be people that'll pay their tithe. One person will be over here, oh, you got to give the 10%. They're probably going to check my record. They got the person over here, 10%'s all that I get to give? Why can't I give it all? Why can't I just give all? Well, they're going to ask me to serve down at the church. I guess I got to at least show up, let my face be seen. They're going to ask me to do something. Got this person over here. Oh, it's time to go home already? I wanted to give more. I wanted to serve more. You see the difference? They're doing the same thing, but there is a heart motive that is entirely different. This person over here, I guarantee you, they are not going to want to do those things for all of eternity. But these folks over here, you're not going to be able to stop them from doing it for all of eternity. In fact, they really don't even care what it is. Just, Lord, give me something that is an expression of you, and I want to do it forever because it's all about you. You're not heavy. You're my Lord. That's what it's really all about. It's a heart issue. It's a motive. So when we talk about this sanctification process that we go through where we consecrate ourselves, we surrender, He purifies our heart. Do you know what happens? It addresses us in the area of our motives more than any other area. Notice the reward that was given to the two servants who truly loved Him. Matthew 25:21. He says, well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invite you into eternity, and I'm going to give you many, 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 many more times the things that you were already doing. I'm going to put you in charge of many things. You say, whoa, wait a second. I didn't like the things I was already doing, and I'm just going to get more? Not sure I want to be a part of that. And therein lies the truth of a parable. Jesus lets us decide. Do you want to be His disciple that's so in love with Him that everything you do is driven out of your love for Him? Or do you want to be a religious person that's just checking off boxes, somehow thinking it's going to get you across the finish line in the end, and you're going to lay it down, and it's going to be eternal retirement at a resort? I have good news if that's the weight that you've been carrying. Are you living under the weight of an obligation? Is this really all just an obligation in hopes of getting in? And when you get there, you can finally lay it down? The good news is that you can lay it down right now. And you can enter into a love relationship with God that will leave you hungering and thirsting for more of Him. Hungering and thirsting for anything that involves Him. Because when you're in love with the Master, it's going to change the motive behind everything that you do. You see, He wants us to live in the blessing of a get-to relationship with Him. He doesn't want us to live in a have-to religion. That's the nice thing about church. It's voluntary. You didn't have to be here. You don't have to give. You don't have to do anything. None of it. In fact, that's the whole idea. You remember church was letting out one day, and Jesus and his disciples were some of the last to get out. I don't know what the configuration of the temple was at that point in time. That's not really important. But what was important is how they let church out, because it was about it was more of a religious, social status kind of thing. And so picture this in your mind. As you left, they didn't have offering plates and all of those things. There was no online giving back in those days. But people had coins, and that was the currency of the day. So as they were leaving, you can imagine that the offering receptacles were empty, and the first ones to drop their coins in made the most noise, right? So when they dropped them in, everyone could hear it. And so the big rollers were the first ones to go out. They went out first, and they dropped theirs in, and people would, I wish I could give like that. How holy can you be when you can give that much money? And there was a status thing going on, and you can imagine as people filed out and the offering was ongoing, the last people to go out were the ones that received the least amount of aha. Who was the last one to go out? This little old lady was walking out. We don't even know who she was, where she got the coins that were in her hand, but we know that it was just a few small coins, and when she dropped them in, the containers had probably filled enough where it barely made a clink, and no one noticed, except Jesus. And Jesus said to his disciples, did you see that? Did you see that all just unfold? Let me tell you who gave the most today. It was the one that dropped the 2 small coins in the container last, because she gave everything. How does Jesus know the balance sheet of her checking account? Well, I don't think he was talking about her checking account. I think he was looking at the motives of her heart. And she gave what she gave that day, didn't care at all whether the pastor or the staff or the board or anyone else saw what she gave. She was giving to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and he saw that. You know, one day we're going to stand before him. I don't think he's going to be harsh. I don't think he's going to be heavy-handed. I just think he's going to look straight through us at the motives of our heart and the intent of our hearts. He's going to know those things that we did out of love for him, and he's going to know those things that we did out of obligation. And that's why he said to the one, come on in. In fact, the last line says, come and share in your master's happiness. What is his happiness? It's anything that's associated with him. Anything that's associated with him. And that's why back in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said, it'll be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so, living so, acting so, thinking so, worshiping so, when he returns. When's he going to come?
Lord, I come, I confess, bowing here, I find my rest. Without you, I fall apart. You're the one that guides my heart. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Where sin runs deep, your grace is more. grace is found is where you are, and where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me, and where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness is Christ in me. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. So teach my soul to rise to you when temptation comes my way. And when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. And when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God.